morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. Today we have a dear friend of mine, Mr. Thomas Riebs, who is the founder and CEO of AXEL. So welcome, Thomas.
Thank you, Wendy. Good to be here.
So you and I met a while ago, and you know a lot about transportation. Today's show is titled, "We Are Not Amsterdam, but Neither Was Amsterdam." And that came directly from you because we're talking about mobility, alternative forms of transportation, getting people out of cars and onto bicycles. And I was always getting the feedback, we're not Amsterdam, this will never happen here. And then I met you. You said neither was Amsterdam.
Nope.
Could you explain that just so people understand what happened?
Well, there's good evidence. You know, it's I'm a huge history buff, so you know I love to see old pictures, read about things that happened in the past, and there's a tendency here when people look around and see all these SUVs and everything else driving around, it's like, wow, there's no way that we're changing this. Well, we got here somehow. Amsterdam got where they are somehow. They made choices. Yes. And if you go back and there are some great pictures, and I have great friends with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they're happy to share these pictures. And they show Amsterdam that are clogged with cars and smog, and it's cluttered and busy. And apart from the fact that this is 34 years ago, you could transpose this and you think, oh yeah, this is downtown Los Angeles, or insert, name a freeway, whatever you want to do. They made some choices, and that's why they are where they are now. The other interesting thing is, I hear people say a lot, there's like, oh, we're the best country in the world. Well, okay, so if you think that the Dutch are doing something well and we're the best country in the world, surely that means that we can do at least as well as they're doing. But, that's just me.
Totally okay. I mean, one of the things that people push back on is we will not get people out of their cars. They love their cars. And then they say, oh, well, weather, inclement weather, we're never going to ride our bicycles. Amsterdam's pretty wet.
Well, I'm from Denmark. And a lot of people say, well, I grew up in Denmark anyway, but people say this, they're like, oh, well, Denmark's such a great country, but the weather, it's interesting. It doesn't get super cold, but, that doesn't mean it's not -10 or 0 degrees Fahrenheit. But people still make their way around. And I remember my wife, who grew up here, first time we were in Denmark in the wintertime, and we're on a bus because public transportation is great. And she looks out the window and sees a bunch of people on bikes, and she says, where are they going? And I was confused because I'm like, well, I don't know these people. What is she doing? How is she asking me this? And said, well, I don't know. They're like going somewhere. It's like, well, why are they going? Why are they on bikes? And I'm like, well, they probably need to go to work. But why are they riding their bikes in the snow? Oh, because it's Tuesday. And she's like, huh? Well, it's like, sure, if there were black ice, which was covered with snow, that would be dangerous, and probably people wouldn't be riding. Certainly people get hurt riding their bikes. People get hurt riding their cars, too, through no fault of their own, in fact, sometimes, And like you said, the weather is interesting. I grew up in a town called Aarhus in Denmark. It's the second largest. It's at 56 degrees north. If there are any geography nerds watching here who understand the distance between 1 degree of latitude, it's about 1,700 miles further north. And so weather is, it's like you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. It'll rain, be sunny, windy, snowing, hail, go back to sunny all in the same day.
Oh, so New England. Okay.
Yeah. New England, but with bike lanes.
Yeah. You got me on that one.
But when it comes to getting I've never been to Amsterdam, so all I'm comparing it to is like the cities that I have been to around the world. In order to get people off the bikes, it also has to be a city that's convenient for biking. So, I mean, I start thinking about like some of the American cities, and I'm like, I don't see how it can turn into a major biking metropolis. So how does that work as well?
The old saying, you tell kids, like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. This will not happen overnight. So you have to make some decisions, right? So among all the great studies, One of them is if you have a local community and it's accessible by bike, meaning you can take your bike there and you can park it safely. And I'm not talking about these enormous tubes that are allegedly bike racks, which are completely useless as bike racks. But if you can take your bike safely to, say, downtown Culver City, uptown Whittier, Altadena, whatever those places are, very inexpensively, by the way, the most inexpensive infrastructure you can possibly invest in is cycling infrastructure. So we just went through a global pandemic, lockdowns, all this other stuff, and we have these outdoor, I think planners call them parklets, where people can eat outside, which is terrific. However, you still need to go to that place in a car, which most of them are pretty large. And if you could ride your bikes, that would be it. That would encourage people who live close by to come to that place, because once you're in your car, if you live in Beverly Hills or in Culver City or in El Monte or wherever, and you're in your car, what's to prevent you from saying, well, we may as well go to that restaurant in a different city altogether? So I would think city planners for the 88 cities in LA County would look at this and say, okay, well, if we invest in the cheapest possible infrastructure that keeps people's spending dollars in our city, generating sales tax in our city, that might be worthwhile at least talking about. And that's the first step.
You were just addressing the issue, which I think when people talk about a biking infrastructure, you just mentioned a thing which popped up to my mind, is that it has to be local, because when you think about a major city like LA and people say, oh, we need to bike everywhere. No one's biking from downtown LA to Santa Monica to go to work.
I know one person who does.
Okay, there's one. But the reality is, when you start dealing with huge major metropolitan areas, to try to do a biking infrastructure, it has to be a local thing in order to get to do it.
Yeah, you have to start local.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think from there, you work on the actual public infrastructure, where you have the subway lines or the bus lines or the other ways that you can bike from one bike to that, ride that, then bike from there.
Yes. So you can do a combination of things, and if that's one of the things where, when people say things like, well, not in Amsterdam, or we're not Copenhagen, or oh, Denmark's a small country, or Holland's a small country, and we're a huge country, and we're an enormous metropolis. Well, yeah, but city, county leaders, state leaders are also happy to say that we're a county with 88 cities. So not all the cities are small. That's all the neighborhoods are not all the cities are large, right? But not all the neighborhoods are enormous. We're not talking about taking the entire country and converting it to cycling only infrastructure. Again, it's like, it's not like we're saying it, and I certainly am not saying like, oh, let's take people's SUVs away. But there are benefits to people who are in SUVs if there are people who do want to ride their bikes from downtown to Santa Monica, which isn't far, by the way. If there are just a small fraction of people who say like, okay, well, we will ride our bikes. The people who need to or want to drive whatever car they have, and it doesn't have to be a large SUV, but the people who want to drive, there'll be more space for them. I mean,
just to bring up a couple.
That's just a part of the conversation that isn't addressed, because it gets to be much like everything everywhere right now. It's either this way or this way. It's like, no. Let's look at how we can get all sides together on this issue. And I think that, so when I know that there was a lot of big brouhaha in LA over creating bike lanes, because some of them were just a disaster, what they created, especially when I think about going down Venice Boulevard, where they moved the bike, you had 2 lanes of traffic, then you had parking, then you had a bike lane. I'm like, okay, this is just a bleep show, what they created to do that, because it was just so dangerous and confusing for people. So I think that's the part, is that it's like, okay, let's do this. We're going to slap it together. Then we'll figure it out. Oh, it didn't work. Now we're going to get rid of it, versus really addressing it from the beginning, to make something that makes sense.
Yeah, and that configuration, because I've driven that, and I was like, where do I drive? I don't know where to go. But to also add into Joel's comment, safety is very important. Our bike lanes are not protected. A green strip in the road does not stop someone from double parking or swinging into that lane or hitting someone. And then another issue I have is our bike lanes are not connected between cities. So you'll be on your bike lane for like 6 blocks and then it just goes away.
Yeah.
And you are now in the road. And we have to work together. So bringing Joel's concept and Thomas's yours, we have to work together, and we're not doing that.
And that brings me back to what you were saying, Joel, about riding from, I forget what you said, from downtown to Santa Monica, or about riding longer distances. I think what downtown to Santa Monica is what, like 16 miles ish?
Maybe. I think
let's say 20 miles. If you're riding, at a relatively reasonable pace, I mean, that shouldn't take you that long. One of the things that they've done around Copenhagen is they've put in what they call super bike lanes, and they're basically bike express lanes that go between cities. Now, a lot of people in Denmark ride bikes, and it's one of those things where people are like, well, again, we're not Denmark. No, because people in Denmark have been riding bikes for decades, and this is a process that's taken time.
Yeah.
But you got to start local, build small. It's inexpensive, but learn from what other people have done. Don't make mistakes. Don't be like, okay, well, we know how to do this. Well, that seems to not be the case. So there's the Danish cycling embassy, there's the Dutch cycling embassy, and yes, those are real things.
They are.
They will send people who will say, hey, city of Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, Los Angeles, here are where we see opportunities for you to get started. Here's sort of next step. Here's like a phased approach. One of the things, I had some conversation with the city of Los Angeles about this, Julia Thane Mordaunt, who is now at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and we were talking about this, and initially they'd said like, oh, well, we should have a bike summit. My suggestion was, we have a micro summit. We should go into neighborhoods. We should talk to local businesses and say, hey, what do you think about this? How do your clients get here? How do your customers get here? I was in a community on the east side of the county, and there's a 20-minute parking right around the corner from where there's a coffee shop. Mind you, it's like people asking me, like, is this walking distance? I'm like, you're asking the wrong guy. I'm from Denmark. Well, what do you mean? Oh, it's 20 minutes. Oh, that's not walking distance. So it's not a quarter of a mile. I mean, it's like an eighth of a mile. I'm like, okay, there's a 20-minute parking. I can park, get my coffee, and get back in the car. All of a sudden, this woman hails me. And she's like, is that you? Did you park around the corner? Who's asking this? Well, that's for the store. That's only for people who are visiting the store. I'm like, no, actually, that's public street parking. That's for whoever wants to park there for 20 minutes. I mean, I kind of know the parking rules. And she's like, well, the city put that in, and it's just for me, and I own that store, and it's just for me.
Wow.
Okay, no. In fact, if you want to get more people coming to your store, talk to the city about putting in bike stands and engaging with your customers. How are you actually communicating with your customers that it's easy for them to get here and to stay here and to spend money here? So start with small stuff, and then think in the larger stuff. Think like what Wendy's saying, connecting the cities. How and where can we connect cities? And there are these big streets like Venice and others. I know that Melrose, they were talking about doing a big section of bike lanes. Apparently, a police captain told the city council member who is elected in that district that she thought it was a bad idea because she thought it might be difficult for police and other emergency vehicles to get through. Of course, that's not the experience from countries and cities where they have bike lanes galore. In fact, often it's easier because it's easy for bikes to get off of the wide bike lanes and onto the sidewalk and allow an ambulance to pass through down the bike lane. I'm not saying that's a terrific idea, but it opens up possibilities also.
So let's talk a little bit about like, so as Denmark made the transition over to a bike, all the biking with Amsterdam and everything, but what was the infrastructure already in place like? Like, how was the city already set up in order to make that transition?
Well, it's interesting because all these cities in Europe, they're old
Mhm.
and they're small and they have narrow streets, and you know, it's like if you just look at history, I mean, like Amsterdam goes back 5, 6, 800. I mean, heck, I don't even know the history of Amsterdam. Um, Copenhagen has its sort of its birth date is set at 1167. I know my hometown goes back to at least the year 900. There are streets in the city center that are still named the Moat and the Rampart because that was the extent of the city about 1,000 years ago. And so the existing infrastructure was really difficult because the streets are really narrow. One of the reasons that more people drive smaller cars in Europe is that streets in the cities are really narrow, and if you did have a full-size SUV, a full-size truck, you would have a hard time navigating around streets. Copenhagen, after a big fire in the 1700s, put in an ordinance that buildings had to have their corners cut off because the horse-drawn fire trucks couldn't make the go through the intersection in one turn.
Right.
And if you've ever had the opportunity to have horses try to back up with a heavy cart behind them, that's not a fun show. So it was really difficult, and they still made it work. But it was
it's affecting change. And one of the things you and I talked about previously was when Amsterdam did switch over to bicycles, the automobile drivers did not care for that.
No.
And there were actual fist fights in the street between cyclists and automobile drivers. So they had their challenges, they had their pushbacks, but they figured it out. And that's what we need to do. And not just LA, but across the country, across the world. We need to figure out how to work together. I'm not saying, again, as Thomas said, we're not kicking people out of their SUVs. We're not kicking people out of their cars. We're providing options. And before I let Thomas cover that, someone that is a good friend of mine posted a picture on Facebook of a guy on a scooter in the driving lane and saying how selfish and self-entitled he was for taking up a lane instead of the cars, and he should be on the sidewalk. And I commented saying, he's not allowed on the sidewalk. He's a motorized scooter. He's doing exactly what he's allowed to do. And the pushback and the retaliation was swift and fierce. But the reality being is we're not entitled or taking away, we're sharing. And that's all it is.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's so many ways of looking at cycling and sort of multimodal transportation. I look at cycling as an economic development tool. I look at it as a transportation tool, as a city planning tool. I mean, there's so many different aspects to it. But you know, if someone says, "Hey, this guy or gal is riding a scooter and is super selfish," well, if you're in a very large vehicle of whatever kind and you're driving down the freeway or the street, you're taking up a lot more real estate. Then you go somewhere and then you park and you take up an enormous amount of real estate where, you know, there are lots of great pictures of people who compare to like, well, here's a car parked in Amsterdam in 1985, and now here is the same spot and there are 40 bikes parked there. And if there's this picture that gets shared on Twitter fairly frequently, at least on my feed, and it shows one of the bridges leading into the inner city in Copenhagen, and it shows a bike lane which looks like it's empty, but you see the backlog. I mean, the vehicle traffic is moving very slowly, and if you're actually paying attention, you see just bikes zipping by, and it's incredible how many. I think it's like a 30-second clip. It's incredible how many bikes pass by. And there's a bus in the picture too, but in that time that all these bikes pass by, the bike doesn't make it through the bus doesn't make it through the frame, whereas all these bikes are just zooming along.
Yeah.
that also makes it a
Viable
health.
alternative. It's a viable alternative.
Yeah.
So for the United States, let's just stick to LA since that's where we are. What would be like the top 3 things that the city of Los Angeles could do to implement proper bike lanes on our major streets? What do you think that the first thing they should do?
Education.
Ooh, yeah.
So one of the things growing up in Denmark and growing up in a lot of European countries is when you're a kid, you start with walking training. So they teach you how to walk and cross the street and look left twice before you cross and all this other stuff and how to cross at an intersection. But then you also get cycling training, and they run through signs and everything else. And this is like in the 3rd or 4th grade or something like that, because it's assumed that kids will be riding their bikes to school.
Yeah.
But even if kids are not riding their bikes to school, they'll probably be riding their bikes around the neighborhood, and it's good to teach them bike safety. I mean, we don't teach people how to drive, and that's evident when you're driving around town or driving on the freeway. I mean, that's not just here. I just did a cross-country road trip this summer, and it's evident that no place actually teaches driving. But start with education. Start teaching kids how to ride bikes. The other part is engage with businesses and tell them, listen, there's nothing to be afraid of, but it's actually easier for people who live locally to get here on their bikes.
Mm-hmm.
Tell them to talk to their city council members. Well, tell me explain to me why are we not investing in cycling infrastructure? But starting small, starting very local, start with schools, start with businesses, and then go to neighborhoods. Find out where there are neighborhood councils, or invite people, or do a block party, and engage with cycling manufacturers. I'm sure that some of the cycling manufacturers that are based in the U.S. would be happy to engage with neighborhoods and say, well, listen, it's not, you don't have to spend $10,000 for a bike. You can get a very inexpensive bike. You can buy used bikes.
Yeah.
But you can get a very inexpensive bike to get around your neighborhood. Teach people about safety, helmets, lights, locks. What do you do when you're downtown and you want to eat at your local restaurant? How do you secure your bike? And do bikes get stolen? Yes. Do cars get stolen? Yes. So, I mean, bikes are different than cars, but also similar in many ways.
Very true. I mean, I just have to go back to the fact that there is a Danish cycling embassy, I think is what you called it. And that's, if they already know the formula to get this done, we should absolutely be engaging with them and inviting them to teach us, because every city's different. Every city's going to have a different way of doing things, but we can at least learn the blueprint. And then most importantly, we got to connect our cities and make dedicated, safe lanes, because putting people in the middle of the street with a car, and usually, there's some road rage that's going to go on, and people are going to say, get out of my lane. This is a car lane, not a bike lane. We got to stop that. Because I had a friend probably maybe 15, 16 years ago was hit by a car and dragged for a bit and ended up in the hospital for a while. And it was, avoidable, but this happens. And that's why I'm always an advocate of, don't give me a green stripe down the road, protect that lane, put up a barrier. And as Joel said, don't put it in the middle of the road so we're having people crossing in front of each other. You got to put it off to the side and actually make it a dedicated, protected lane that someone cannot double park in, that someone can't swerve into. And I'm just going to go back to going to the embassies. Teach us how to do it. You guys figured it out. Bring it over here. We just have to pull that trigger.
Yeah, and I guess I'd like to put in a plug for a book that I'm reading. It's called The Human Element, and it talks about new ideas and what stands in the way of implementing new ideas. and they talk about, I think, the 6 emotions that are described in almost every culture around the world. And there's one word that's positive, it's happiness. All the others are like fear and anger and disgust and whatever else. But it's like there are all these 5 negative emotions, but they talk about the friction in implementing new ideas.
Yeah.
So I think one of the important places to start also is exactly right. We should definitely address road rage and these ideas that this road belongs to me, because this area belongs to me because I'm in a car and you're not, and this is clearly for cars. But I think one of the ways that we need to address it is by engaging with people and understanding what it is that they're afraid of. And that's why I say, like, we're not trying to take away people's cars, but we're trying to make more space for the people who do need to be in cars, because there are people for whom a vehicle is essential. I mean, obviously there are people who use their car for work, but there are people who for whom, biking might not be as easy. But Joel mentioned also this sort of like multimodal infrastructure, and it is one of the things that you see a lot in Europe is people have more bikes. They have, sort of a cheap, simple bike they use to ride to the bus or train station. Then they get on a bus or train. They travel for a while. You have another one at the end, because it's still a couple miles from that bus or that transit stop. They have another bike over there, and then they get on that bike, go to work, and then reverse the process when they go back. And if you see the bike parking lots at some of these transit stops and we're not just talking about Amsterdam, Berlin, Stockholm, Aarhus, Munich, Paris. Look at what they've done in Paris over the last 2 years. The amount of cycling going on in Paris now, it's frankly embarrassing that we haven't done more.
Oh, wow.
It's so funny because you were talking about electric scooters, and all I can think to myself is, okay, so we do a bunch of biking. The sidewalks are crammed up with people who just throw these scooters everywhere, which creates another set of issues and hazards. I mean, they're dumped all over the sidewalks, they're dumped in people's lawns, they're dumped in the streets. So we got that issue, which they tried, came on like a beast. Just out, that thing was out of control. Then to do and I'm not trying to talk bad about this, I'm just trying to work this out how it works.
It's fact.
Yeah, but I mean, so then you want to introduce a bunch of bikes. Our sidewalks are crammed with the scooters, which are just taking care of everything. Where do the bikes park? Because the sidewalks aren't wide enough. Like I remember where I used to live, our sidewalk, you could have 2 people, at most 3 wide, and most people don't move to try to let the other person get by. So where do the bikes go? Where do you start parking? Are we taking away parking spaces along the street to create bike? Like this is the whole big issue that is like, those are the minor details that I think also have to be figured out in order to go from a car culture, a heavy car culture, and that doesn't even have reliable or that great of a public transportation system, to start implementing taking away this. I mean, it's all intertwined, which I think is going to be interesting. It's going to be a very interesting task to try to get it to do, because it's not just one, that they all have to work together.
Yeah, and the title here is we're not Amsterdam, but neither was Amsterdam. But it's like, what about the Grand Canyon? That wasn't always there, but it gradually wore away. The water just came in and gradually wore away, and it was just this unrelenting progress. And we've just made decisions here, especially in LA. I mean, in other places around the country, we've just made decisions that have sent the water rolling in a particular direction. And there's nothing to, there's no reason to believe that we couldn't change course, that we couldn't, change the stream's course and say, well, we're going to go back to a different course. And I think the key thing is start small.
Yeah.
There's a great, a podcast called Masters of Scale, hosted by Reid Hoffman. I don't agree with him on a bunch of different things, including how he thinks about entrepreneurship as jumping off a building and building the airplane on the way down. But he interviews Brian Chesky of Airbnb, one of the things that really stuck with me that Brian Chesky said was, start with something small that doesn't scale, and kind of figure out, how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this problem? And Airbnb started as Brian and Joe and their third guy was named Nate, I think was the third guy, literally renting air mattresses on the floor in their apartment in San Francisco to people attending a conference. I mean, that doesn't scale. It's not like they would be like, oh, well, let's buy 1 million air mattresses and send them out to people. It's as they moved forward, that idea changed.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting episode. Chesky is an interesting guy and has a very different perspective on how to be an entrepreneur and how to be a tech entrepreneur. I mean, both he and Joe went to RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design.
Yeah.
And so they're not trying to solve things by writing code exclusively. I mean, he talks about this, how, well, we're going to go take pictures of your place so people can see your place and find it more interesting and be more enticed to rent your place. And they started by putting people in a spreadsheet. When that became unmanageable, then they wrote a code for how to send out a photographer. And then increasingly they created more automation. And what I'm suggesting is the same thing. Is this is a great tool for cities, for businesses, for people, for kids. I mean, how great would it be if you felt comfortable saying to your kids, well, time for school, go grab your bike. You're going to be riding your bike to school.
Yeah, I mean, I did as a kid because I grew up in Michigan. It was a little bit easier, and that's kind of what you did. But before we close out, because we're past our 30 minutes, Thomas, how do people find you? Because you do offer your advisory services for people who don't know how to make sustainable change. So what's the best way for them to find you?
Our website is AXEL-US.com, AXEL-US.com. So we're an advisory firm. We focus on environmental sustainability, transportation certainly being one of them. And I specifically say that we're an advisory firm because we're perfectly happy telling you that the box that you are thinking inside should be folded up and sent to recycling. And you should start from a completely different perspective and look elsewhere for a better solution.
Absolutely. You got to think differently. If we're going to make, I mean, what was it? Einstein who said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We got to take the box, fold it up, and recycle it. We got to think outside the box and completely change everything we're doing. So on that, Thomas, thank you so much. Guys, check out AXEL-US.com. And I thank 𝑗oel for joining us today. He's my co-host with Environmental Social Justice. And I am your host, Wendy Nystrom. We will see you guys next time. Take care. Have a great night.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Joel.